Okay, so hi everyone. I have Kane B with me, and I think Kane B is amazing, just brilliant. I just want to say, thank you for all your work. Like, seriously, your philosophy videos have been really helpful. And
I mean, that's great to hear. I'm glad I could be of assistance to people. So thanks for the kind words.
yes,
And
yes.
thanks for inviting
And
me to have a conversation.
of course, I mean, it is like a few months ago, I was a moral realist, or you could say like I was leaning toward moral realism. But
Mm.
like after like hearing you uh, and like just thinking about it more, I think moral error theory does make sense. Probably even more than realism. And I mean, here's why, right? Like, uh, I do not know what work moral realism is doing. Like when people say that moral facts exist independently of stances objectively in the world, out there, I'm thinking, but it's still ultimately your emotional attitudes that actually are doing the work. Because I mean, like, what 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 is with this thing with objectivity? I suppose like you are just like making this thing out there which is uh, like where is it floating? Like, is it an abstract object, you know like kind of like mathematical platonism and stuff? But even then, like, I'm thinking, why like inflate your ontology? Like, you criticized moral realism for like, inflationary ontology. And i and i thought that was a really good criticism. Because like, and it's not just ontology that's inflationary. Like, I just do not get what would you do by saying that, okay, these facts are objective. Because if there is someone who says like, and the the way of accessing these facts is intuition. Like, it's not like there is some experimental material going on or anything. It's intuition. That's the main thing, right? And if someone just says, like, you say something is self-evident, and someone just says, no, it's not. So
Mm.
what are you going to do, right? So like, what are your thoughts on these things, I suppose?
Oh, well, I guess there's quite a lot to, yeah, there's a lot to go over there. Um, so, yeah, I mean, with respect to the point about inflationary ontologies, I mean, it's so we have to kind of clarify that there are, of course, different forms of moral realism available. So, one of the big distinctions is between moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism. If you're a moral naturalist, you're going to say that moral properties are just standard natural properties. So you have a very sort of simple form of moral naturalism might say that moral goodness is just a matter of pleasure, and pain is bad, right? So well, we already believe in pleasure and pain, so I guess you're not really inflating your ontology if you are that kind of moral realist. But no, I mean, a lot of moral realists go for this non-naturalist view. There are like attempts to avoid the kind of ontological implications of this. I mean, Derek Parfit is a non-naturalist, and but he would deny that there are these like metaphysically robust moral properties. I find it very difficult to understand how his view actually works. So most non-naturalists will acknowledge that, they are like, they're believing in stuff. They're believing that reality contains more stuff than, what we get than what we might be described, say, by our best scientific theories and so on. That in itself isn't decisive, of course, because realists do have arguments, and when we're evaluating our ontological commitments, one thing we want to bear in mind is simplicity, and the fact that realism involves a commitment to these non-natural moral values, or at least non-naturalist realism involves a commitment to that. Well, it counts against it in that sense. But of course, realists are going to say, well, we have convincing arguments for this position. And so in that sense, it's not really an inflationary ontology at all. After all, the point of things like Occam's razor is you don't multiply entities beyond necessity. But if you think the realist arguments are convincing, then you do have the necessity. You do have the necessity to multiply entities, at least with respect to moral facts. Now, of course, I don't find the arguments for realism convincing, but I guess just to say something about something in defense of the realist here, that's the sort of line that they'll take in response to that. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, sure. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity, right? But yeah, sure, that makes sense. However, even still the thing is, it is always the person that is doing the main work, I suppose, of probably pushing someone to do something. Like these objective facts, which are only accessible by intuition.
Mm.
Like if there is a substantial disagreement, like if there is literally an intuitive disagreement, you basically have to start thinking about other intuitions and other ways, to convince someone of your position, So it's like, I do not know what work they are doing, moral facts are doing. And I suppose I do not generally suppose Platonism overall, like creating entities, abstract objects just out there. And even though I believe in God, so
Okay.
so I have very
well. I guess God wouldn't be an abstract object, right? Presumably,
yes.
I don't know. Maybe it depends on how you conceive of him, but I guess it's not abstract.
Yes, I mean God
Yeah.
is a concrete object, and this is what I'm saying, right? Like if God exists, and I'm thinking about what would be more kind of impactful or suppose impressive, right? I mean, so people say that moral facts are out there and mathematical facts are out there, we are discovering these facts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, okay, what would be more compassionate or impressive for God to do for human beings in some sense? Like if human beings invent something versus discovering something, I think inventing is in some sense more impressive.
Yeah.
It seems more impressive, right? Like we have invented these things and they work really well compared to when we just say, oh, we are just discovering these facts, just accessing these facts. In that sense, nominalism and emotional attitudes rather than these moral facts going on about, I think that's perhaps more impressive. I mean, it's a side project that I'm developing, how with even with nominalism, mathematical nominalism, and even with moral error theory, if you are like a moral error theorist or, a non-cognitivist, even then you can like believe in God, you know.
Mm.
That's a side project that I'm thinking of.
It's
Uh,
an interesting point that you that you make. I mean, well, I'm an atheist, so obviously I'm not really concerned about what would be most impressive. But there is a point that realists make, which is they say that one of the like intuitively unattractive things about moral anti-realism is that it feels like anti-realists do not take morality seriously. There's a book by David Enoch, which is literally called Taking Morality Seriously. And he makes this explicit. He says that like you can give kind of technical philosophical arguments for positions, but very often you find that, behind those technical philosophical arguments, people sort of there's just also these like just common sense, I guess, feelings that we have for certain positions. And in the case of realism versus anti-realism, there's this feeling that anti-realists fail to take morality seriously. That, to say that it's ultimately up to us kind of drains morality of its significance. And I have to say, I've always found that really weird. Because to me, it's kind of, it's the exact opposite. Like my feeling on this is like, well, no, morality is something that matters to us. It's something that we have to work at, and the idea that we're just going to kind of, when I think about realism, it's almost as if they're just sort of trying to give up their responsibility to sort of, it's like we have a responsibility for our values, and by pretending that those values are like out there in the world, that they're facts that we can be right or wrong about, it's almost like we're kind of giving up responsibility for them. Again, this isn't an argument against realism, but it's just like my sense is actually it's the anti-realists who take morality seriously, not the realists. So I guess you've kind of expressed a similar sort of sentiment there. That anti-realism is it's more impressive. It's something we've invented. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe we agree on that, or have similar sentiments on that.
The thing is, and this is I think, I suppose this seems like a bit uncharitable towards like in the part of moral realists, like how they think that we are not taking morality seriously. When I mean this happens, right? Like I think Lance Bush talked about like normative entanglement, where someone asks you, do you believe it is objectively wrong to commit genocide or something? And here's the thing, right? If someone says no to that, then they are considered a very sick person, right? Like a very horrific person to be around. But the thing is, moral anti-realists are not, I mean, even moral anti-realists generally agree that it is horrific, it is messed up to commit these kinds of horrific actions, these. So what I'm thinking is, rather than like using the word objective and the word wrong, it is better to just use this is horrific, this is messed up. We do not want the person to do that thing, and we will stop them because these are our emotional attitudes. And not just that, we can like think of a world, like we can compare worlds where certain actions are like permitted, and a world where certain actions like these kinds of like certain worlds where genocide is not permitted. So we can compare these two worlds and we can say that, okay, look, in a world where genocide is not permitted, it is a world that is tranquil, that is peaceful. It is a world in which our own like self-interest is preserved, Yeah. So, and and the thing is, moral anti-realist, when like if I have to convince someone as a moral anti-realist, I don't have to go, okay, these intuitions are self-evident, the talk is over. Because, because the thing is, if someone just says, it's not self-evident to me, okay, what are we going to do now? We have to just start thinking about other things. We have to start thinking about their interests. We have to start thinking about their other intuitions, right? So why not just be swift, be quick and directly engage with like other intuitions, because the person in front of you already does not agree with some of the things, right?
Mhm.
So why not just, because talking about like self-evident propositions to you, like there is substantial disagreement about certain things in our world right now. Like for instance, some people believe that apostasy, open apostasy, like a kind of a public apostasy, if you leave religion and speak against the religion, then that is punishable offense, right? And if a moral realist from the West says that that's wrong, that's self-evident, that's intuitive, the person who believes that apostasy deserves to be punished will just say, okay, it's not self-evident to me. What are you going to do about it now, right? You always have to start like thinking about their interest, what their other emotional attitudes with the thing, and perhaps you can then maybe convince them that, hey, look, we should not punish apostasy or like leaving religion. So the thing is, like, moral realism, I do not know what work is it doing, right? Because like when I compare moral realism with my belief in God, like personally, my belief in God helps me psychologically. Like that's the major thing. Like um, I'm an optimist because I believe in God, who cares about me, who cares about you, who cares about everyone, who is like compassionate, and kind and caring and, merciful. So that belief actually helps me psychologically. And perhaps like, I mean, that's, yeah, like it's mostly psychologically, I suppose. Yeah, but it is a huge thing. But these objective moral facts, I don't know what they're doing.
Well, I mean, I suppose like one thing a realist might say to this is that this might be just the wrong kind of way to evaluate their theories. I mean, it might be the case that moral realism versus anti-realism doesn't have any kind of practical consequences. I suppose actually you could perhaps turn this around on the anti-realist and say, well, okay, what practical work is moral anti-realism doing? I mean, it doesn't seem to make that much difference whether we believe that there are objective moral facts. The kind of arguments that we give when we engage with people, when we sort of try to negotiate conflicts of interest and so on, are going to be basically the same sort of thing. So, moral realists, you've pointed out, they appeal to intuitions. But, I mean, as anti-realists, we kind of have to do that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, so it so happens that, like, thankfully, people tend to share the same intuitions, broadly speaking. I mean, well, maybe not people, but at least people in my society with the same sort of cultural background, I can usually expect that they're going to have similar intuitions. So, if I encounter somebody who holds a different moral view, I might be able to appeal to certain shared values. So like, you see this in, say, the debate about a topic like abortion. You have the pro-choice side appealing to shared values of bodily autonomy. You have the pro-life side appealing to shared values of, like, the wrongness of killing innocent people. And I think that it's like, well, does it make any practical difference whether we conceive of these values as being objectively true or as just being invented by us? Oh, maybe not. I mean, moral realism versus anti-realism is ultimately a philosophical question, and maybe it's just in the nature of a lot of philosophical debates that they don't make a lot of practical difference. On the other hand, I you know what, I mean, I've met people who say that their belief in moral realism does make a difference to them. Like, I mean, I've met people who will say that, yeah, like if I didn't believe in moral realism, then I would feel like I just have no reason at all to care about other people, to act in accordance with certain moral norms. And I mean, I find that really weird. That's bizarre to me, but I mean, who am I to say? I mean, that's just a description of their psychology, and if that's the case for them, then I guess moral realism is doing work for them. So, yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, I think ultimately the debate is going to come down to, like, okay, well, what reasons are there to think that this position is true or false? The question of, like, the practical applications of it, yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, so like you said earlier, how like you met some moral realists who say that if they did not have objective morality, then they would not have like this reason to do moral things. And I'm thinking, like that seems a little weird. Like, so suppose if someone does not have mercy, compassion, and I'm talking about like character, not the action of mercy, like mercy, compassion, kindness, they are empathetic person, they care about animals, they care about people. Mm-hmm. And suppose there is someone who just doesn't, in fact, who does the opposite. He likes like torturing puppies and people along with the puppies. Yeah. So, and he says morals are objective. And I would be confused, like, first of all, because to me, when someone says morals are objective, I think at least they seem to have a strong intuition that it is wrong to torture innocents, right? Mm-hmm. It's wrong to torture innocents. Like, I suppose I do share that intuition, but like, to me, it's the major part is the emotional attitude part. Like, it is horrific. It is something that I want to stop, right? Like, not just stop and like punch the person who is doing the torturing of other people and stuff like that. If these like if these I don't know why people have these weird things about like objectivity, I suppose. Like, if something is not objective, then it's like you do not need to care about it. But like, why? Like, there are many things that are not objective. You care about them. Like, I mean, objectively, like in the sense like some kind of abstract objective fact existing out there. Like, if someone likes chocolate, right? And or someone likes playing video games, like, is there some objective fact that is making them play video games, or like forcing them to do this, right?
Yeah,
because no, right? I mean, of course, there are people who are like just saying value exists independently of minds and stances, right? Like, overall broader value realism about stuff. But like, that's a view that I think is really, that seems inflationary, right? I mean, you literally are thinking that these values exist mind independently and stance independently. And I should also mention that, like, personally, I think metaphysical idealism is true. So, I mean, to say that moral facts and mathematical facts exist independently of God would be the most weird thing to say.
Yeah, I guess that would be especially inflationary from your point of view. So,
Yeah.
yeah, if you're not even postulating mind independent, physical objects, for instance. Yeah, I think that in the end, regardless of what we're supposing exists in the world, I mean, what we care about is up to us, and there's no way around that. So you can suppose that there are objective moral facts, you can suppose that there are objective aesthetic facts, and actually a lot of philosophers do think that there are facts, there is objective aesthetic value. So one of the problems with like drawing like we sort of try to make these kind of partners in crime arguments where we sort of say, well, moral value seems similar to aesthetic value, or it's like, supposing that there's a fact of the matter that chocolate cake is good. Like that would just be really weird, right? But the trouble is that actually a lot of philosophers are quite happy to just endorse the claim that, yeah, I mean, it is a fact of the matter that chocolate cake is good. I mean, that seems to be the case, right? I think that in the most recent Phil Papers survey, something like 40% endorsed objectivism about aesthetic value, which presumably includes gustatory value. So the aesthetics of taste would presumably be part of that. Again, I find that really weird, but apparently some philosophers are happy with that. But my point, what I was saying is, regardless of of the way that we populate the world with value, it's up to me, like, to choose what I care about. I mean, if you tell me that it's an objective fact that chocolate cake is better than vanilla cake, I'm just going to say, like, so what? Like, why should I care about that? I like chocolate cake. I like chocolate cake more, and that's what matters to me. And it's kind of the same with morality. Like, look, maybe it turns out that there are moral facts. I might be surprised by that. It would be, a revelation from an intellectual point of view. But I mean, yeah, it wouldn't make any real difference to me. It wouldn't make any difference to what I care about. Of course, that's not really an argument against moral realism, but it's just, I guess this is another way of putting this point, that it's odd to me that it's realists who often say that anti-realists don't take morality seriously, because I kind of feel like realists are just talking about, it's like they're almost changing the subject, it's like they're just talking about something completely different. It's, because I want to say, well, I look, there are some things that I don't want. There are things that I care about. Like, I want to live in a world which is peaceful. So I don't want to live in a world in which there's genocide. And if somehow it turned out that there were moral facts, and one of those facts was that we, ought to commit genocide against certain peoples, I was just like, well, yeah, but like, so I don't want to do that. I don't want to live in that world. So I'm going to carry on, arguing against genocide and trying to stop people from committing genocide. I'm going to carry on, voting against politicians who promote genocide, etc., etc. The moral facts would have sort of no force on me. And it's the same with other, like, supposedly objective values. And actually, I think that, you sometimes see this kind of thing explicitly expressed by people, at least in the aesthetic domain, because I sometimes see people say, not just philosophers, but like, just people online, when I'm talking online, people will say things like, oh, I think that Joe's Garage is Frank Zappa's best album, but my favorite Frank Zappa album is Them or Us. Now, I mean, obviously, as an anti-realist, I think there are serious problems with this way of speaking. But it kind of communicates the point, right? Like, these people seem to be recognizing the idea that, okay, there's the objective value is that Joe's Garage is the best, but that's not going to make any difference to what they want to listen to. It's like, if they like Them or Us more, that's what they're going to listen to. Same goes for other types of values.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a lot. So and and a lot of things that kind of make sense to me too. So here's the thing about aesthetics too, and just about value realism, right? When you say that all values are like objective facts, so it also says something about your commitments towards these values. So for example, if something is objectively beautiful, or like if someone makes an objectively good music, right?
Mm.
And then someone else just goes up in the opposite direction and just wants to make the most annoying music, you know, because the person likes annoying music, perhaps, the person suppose likes ugliness
Yeah,
a
well,
little
we don't
bit.
have to suppose, because you're just basically describing my taste in music, I think. But
I mean, so I was thinking, like, if someone likes ugly things or ugly objects, like, I mean, so as you talked about, like, earlier in your videos, you liked movies by uh, what's the name of the director who makes those thriller movies, really messed up thriller movies.
is this
You
David Lynch? It might have been Lynch.
Yes, David Lynch, right?
Mm.
And here's the thing, right? We say that David Lynch's work is a high art because in some sense it breaks boundaries, you know, even aesthetic boundaries, it seems to us, right? And then we are like literally juggling these objective values, right? Like, but if you just remove objective values, we can just say, look, we are human beings, we have feelings, and these feelings are complex, you know. So sometimes we like a little bit of ugliness, right? Sometimes we like great tranquility. Sometimes we like to be afraid, you know, in our own ways, right? But if you just posit these objective values out there, not only you have your feelings with you, now you have these objective values that you are like juggling around and like thinking about, okay, why do people like ugly stuff? Now perhaps someone like the value realist can say people like ugly stuff because they have like deficiency in their brain or something, but I'm thinking that it's not just those, like even moral realists would love certain like messed up movies. I mean, like, so there's like as David Lynch movies, or there are other great directors who make masterpiece movies, which are in some sense messed up but also sometimes funny. For example, like Martin Scorsese, right? Like
Mhm.
his movie Goodfellas, right? it is it is a lot of messed up things happen in that movie where they are like literally killing without any reason and laughing, you know. And if value is objective, right? Now you have some kind of incongruence with feelings and values. And now you have to do extra work. That's the thing that also kind of bothers me. Like, now you have these objective values out there. Now you have to think about them too, rather than your
Yes.
feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose that I mean, what would an aesthetic objectivist say about this? I guess that they would probably say that actually ugliness can be aesthetically good, like objectively aesthetically good. But I mean, yeah, I like this is one thing that is worth bearing in mind is that, I mentioned we spoke earlier about this problem of inflationary ontology, and it's actually not just an issue of inflationary ontology, because once you postulate objective value, well, you've added some stuff to your ontology, but you now also are going to have a whole bunch of explanatory problems, because, like you're going to have the problem of explaining, okay, how do we detect these values? How do these values interact with our responses? So like, what's going on when somebody says that, like, my favorite film is X, but the best film is Y, right? I mean, how do people sort of make those judgments? In the moral domain, you get questions like, all right, which entities have this objective moral status? Why do they have it? How do we weigh competing moral claims? Sometimes you have like the conflict between rights claims and claims about like overall utility. How do we weigh these sorts of things? Under what circumstances are people morally responsible? So you get, all of these questions. And again, like, if you're supposing that there are objective facts, then there's a fact of the matter about all this stuff. It's not something that we're just constructing for practical purposes. Like, there's a fact of the matter about all this, and that does introduce a lot of, well, I guess, theoretical complexity, in addition to the ontological complexity, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that there's also this tendency of separating morality from our emotions too sometimes. Like, morality is like, if you're doing something immoral, you're also doing something irrational. Like, this is the thing with like certain traditional religious arguments, I suppose, like the natural law theory, I think. So I think according to natural law theory, when you do something immoral, it is not just immoral, it is also irrational, I think. Like, that's maybe I'm wrong about this, but so like there's a philosopher who argued about why it is wrong to engage in like consensual sex and fornication, basically. And his argument is that it is irrational to use your faculty in a way that prevents its essential function or the essential realization of that function. So, for example, if someone uses like if someone masturbates, right, in their private house, private home, then they are not hurting anyone, they're alone. They're doing something irrational by doing that action. Like, they're doing something perverted or something like that. And this is like a purely rational argument, something. And does it make sense to you?
Well, I suppose there's the sort of two parts to this, right? There's this general project of trying to show that moral norms are just norms of rationality, which is, I guess, that's like another route to a kind of moral realism. If we can show that, that the moral norms are just norms of rationality, then it looks like a lot of the objections to moral realism kind of are not really applicable, at least not in the same kind of way. All I would say to this is I don't find that project even slightly persuasive, unless you're just going to kind of define rationality in such a sort of strict sense as to kind of entail moral norms. But it seems to me that you can be perfectly rational and have what we would consider completely immoral goals. I think that there's nothing necessarily irrational in desiring to impose suffering and pain on every person you meet. And then the question is just, what are the best means of achieving that goal? And you might be irrational in terms of how you go about trying to achieve that goal. But yeah, I don't think there's anything necessarily irrational about having any particular goal. With respect to the specific example of, failing to use faculties in a way that they're not intended, or I'm not sure if that was exactly what you said, but
Yeah, it's
in the way that
different.
they're not,
It's that
or the,
if you use a faculty in such a
yeah,
way that prevents the essential function
okay,
to happen. So for example, if you use your parts down there in a way that prevents their essential function to be realized. So if you prevent reproduction when
right,
you're
yeah,
using, then that is irrational, or
okay.
that is
So
immoral.
I guess I have, I mean, several points in response to that. First of all, I don't see why it would be irrational to use your parts in a way that prevents their essential function. So I mean, I don't, you know, I don't even think it's necessarily irrational, for instance, to just like chainsaw your arm off or something like that, right? Like if that's what you want to do, if somebody has the desire to just cut off their arm and they completely understand that that's going to be really painful, but they don't care, they just want to get rid of their arm. Yeah, I don't think that's irrational. As David Hume said, it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger, right? I agree with that. So that's one point. The other point is that I'm not sure how the behavior in question, like I'm not sure how masturbation interferes with the function of reproduction. In fact, it might actually help promote it. I think there's some evidence, I could be wrong about this, but I think there's some evidence that regular ejaculation helps to prevent prostate cancer. And there's no evidence that it's at all unhealthy. So, you know, I mean, if that's true, then it looks like you're actually, that by masturbating, you would actually be promoting the purpose of reproduction, because, you know, you'd be reducing your chances of getting a disease which would potentially kill you and stop you from doing that. So in, you know, from that point of view, you're actually helping it. And then third point is, I think there are a lot of problems with the idea of with attributing functions to parts of organisms. I mean, maybe this is a more sort of technical point. Like it's when I talk, we can talk about functions. You know, we can say like, you know, the function of the heart is to pump blood, or the function of sperm is reproduction, or something like that. But I tend to view these sorts of claims in kind of purely causal terms. So it would be like, you know, I can ask like, how exactly is it that the heart like contributes to, you know, the circulation of blood around the body, or how exactly is it that the heart contributes to getting, you know, oxygen to parts of the body? And then you say, well, you know, in that context, the heart functions as a pump. But I don't think things really have like objective functions, like beyond how we're analyzing them in causal terms. So yeah, those are some problems that I would have with that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it's also implications of this one that seems weird. Like the argument is called like perverted faculty argument, and like one weird implication about this is like if you eat something, right, and it tastes horrible, now the digestion process starts in your mouth, right? So when digestion process starts in your mouth, and you like just throw it away, you know, after tasting it because it tastes horrible, like after tasting for like a few seconds, and you just spit it out, you are preventing digestion process from being fully realized, from fully happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the faculty of mouth and the esophagus and the stomach, these faculties, the essential function of these faculties is digestion. And if you prevent digestion from happening, you know, then you are doing something irrational or something like that. And this this just seems straight up false. Like, no, no. And like this is the thing with like with these weird sorts of arguments where they separate like rational morality from emotions. And I suppose even rationality, like there's a separate rationality completely from emotions. And I'm thinking, but there are times where you would yourself say that emotions are deeply connected with rationality. For example, if you see someone torturing innocent persons or puppies, you will say it is righteous to be angry, like it is rational to be angry, right? And so if someone doesn't get angry at that, then they are being irrational or something. Like these people would agree to these statements. It seems, because there is like religious motivation to like,
you mean like the moral realists would agree that it's irrational to fail to get angry? Do you mean?
I would say some moral realists, not
Right.
all, because as I said, like there is this view floating around, right, where they just separate morality from emotions completely. Like here's the thing, right? So uh, so there is something called classical theism, and in that view, God is considered impassible, immutable, uh, absolutely simple, and timeless. And God has only one emotion, and that's happiness. Like that's it. He is in the state of pure bliss, and he's just happy.
Okay.
He does not actually is filled with compassion or mercy. Like he does not get sad. He does not get sad when people are like dying of horrible diseases. He does not get angry when there is some genocide or something like that happening. And that seems so bizarre. Like this is classical theism. This is, I think, what I think even Aquinas thought. He had a very strong conception of divine simplicity and impassibility, because look, if God is affected by the things that are happening in the world, then he's not impassible, because impassible means like he cannot be influenced by anything outside of himself. So if he gets influenced by the things that are happening here, then that would violate impassibility, I suppose. And this is the way that classical theists are arguing that. So this is probably why they separate morality from emotions completely. And to me, it's just complete, straight up implausible. Like it's the most bizarre thing to think about, like separating emotions from both morals and even rationality seems completely nonsensical to me.
Yeah, I suppose it's I mean, I find it like counterintuitive, but I don't know. I think that for at least some realists, I mean, and again, this maybe isn't the case for these realists inspired by that sort of religious tradition. What they might want to say is, well, there might not be like a kind of necessary or logical or conceptual connection between morality and emotion, but it's still going to be the case that, look, people tend to have certain emotional responses in response to viewing particular behavior, and it's, I suppose, kind of similar to how there's a fact of the matter about situations that are dangerous, right? As in, there are certain situations which will put you at risk of physical injury. And so, for instance, if you're walking in the forest and you come across a bear, well, now you're at significant risk of physical injury. And what tends to happen in response to that is you experience fear. But there's no necessary connection there, because it's entirely possible that somebody could be wandering around in the forest and just not care about, their own welfare. And so they come across the bear and it just doesn't move them at all. I guess a moral realist might say, it's similar with the moral facts. Most of us are so constituted that, we react with anger when we see something morally wrong occurring. So if I see, somebody torturing a baby, then I'm going to react with, anger and other emotions like that. But yeah, I mean, there's some psychopaths in the world. They're not going to react that way. So there's there's still a connection between emotion and morality, but it just wouldn't be a sort of necessary connection. And I think that actually, I mean, even for me, like from an anti-realist point of view, I find that point quite convincing, because I think that it seems like people who don't have the same sort of emotional responses as us could still engage like in the kind of construction of moral norms. They would have to do it in a slightly different way to the way that normal people do it, but you can sort of construct moral norms by thinking about just what's in your self-interest. It's like, well, it's in my self-interest to live in a world in which people behave, in which people are peaceful and intelligent and healthy. So I'm going to promote norms that try to create societies where that's how people are. That seems like a reasonable way of proceeding to me.
Yeah, but I mean, even self-interest, like you care about yourself, you still care.
That's true. Yes.
You still care, and like that's the thing about caring, right? Like it is ultimately emotional.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you're right. I don't think you can do it if you get rid of all emotions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I take your point. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a fun conversation. I would love to. So I wanted to talk to you about a paper. Can I like screen share?
Yeah, sure.
So this is a paper by Benjamin Kiesleweder. I think, I am not sure if I'm correctly pronouncing his name. So this is a paper called Are Epistemic Reasons Normative, and he basically argues that this basically, he argues this.
In each case, I argue that the relevant condition is plausibly sufficient for the normativity of a reason, and that normativism is in any case in a much better position to explain the analogy than anti-normativism.
And like, even if this is true, do you think it would like affect moral anti-realists and like epistemic anti-realists in any way? Like,
no. I did actually have a look over this paper, before, well, a little while ago, because you sent it to me, and
yeah,
I think he's very, very quick to dismiss epistemic error theory, which I mean, so look, maybe that's perfectly legitimate in the context of the paper, but he sort of says, well, epistemic error theory is just completely implausible, and I mean, I disagree with that. I think it's a position that, it seems totally reasonable to me. So so according to an epistemic error theorist would say that there just are no epistemic reasons. There are facts about like truth and falsehood. There are facts about reliability. So, there are certain ways of forming beliefs that will tend to maximize truth and minimize falsehood, and so on. But there aren't really any epistemic reasons. There's no such thing as like a reason to believe that P. What we can have as is there are arguments to the effect that P is true, but like that's not a reason to believe that P. So he just kind of dismisses this position, but it's a position that's being defended by professional philosophers. And like I say, I think it's reasonable. It seems to me that all we really need are, sort of like evidential support relations and aims with respect to belief formation. So it so happens to be the case that most of us want to have true beliefs and we want to minimize false beliefs, partly because we think that this is just something that we aim for in itself. We just want true beliefs just for their own sake, and also because true beliefs are instrumentally useful for various projects. Like in order to achieve goals, I'd better have true beliefs about the way the world is. So we aim to have true beliefs, and like that's why we are moved by arguments to the effect that certain propositions are true or false. So I think that my line on this is, if it is the case that, well, actually, I would have several points here, but if it's the case that epistemic reasons are irreducibly normative in the way that's argued in this paper, then I will just go with epistemic error theory. That might not be the case. I think it's an open question, in which case maybe we can kind of reduce the normativity of epistemic reasons. But yeah, I don't find this kind of line particularly convincing as an argument for like categorical normativity.
Yeah. And I mean, the partners in crime argument, as like you and I think Lance Bush, talked about sometime, and like you have talked about partners in crime argument a lot, and and I agree with you. Like people who are moral realists think that this is like a knockdown argument, right, against realism. Like they I think they believe that moral error theorists are like undermining their own position, basically, if they deny epistemic norms or something. But then I'm thinking, how? Like, wait, why? Like they would say that, okay, like if you do not believe that epistemic norms are objective, then you will not be able to say that you have good justification for believing something or not believing something. You will not have something like that, I think. Like, so what's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, so what that, in my view, what these kinds of claims about justification ultimately amount to is it's a matter of we have the aim of true belief, right? And so given that we have that aim, right, there are better and worse ways of achieving that. And when somebody uses a method that tends to reliably produce true beliefs, we'd be inclined to say, okay, their belief is justified. So like that's, I honestly don't think that, I mean, I find it very puzzling that this argument is taken so seriously by so many people, to be completely honest. It seems to me very straightforward to give an account of epistemic norms without appealing to like the notion of kind of categorical normativity, the notion that these are like stance independent facts. I think that maybe part of what part of what maybe is driving this is that there is something odd, I think, about somebody. So imagine if somebody was to say, proposition P is not true, but I believe it. Or they were to say, proposition P is true, but I don't believe it. That would be really weird, right? So yeah. I think that it's like, belief sort of just seems to kind of aim at truth. That might be one way to put it. Or maybe we just say, well, look, by definition, to believe that P is to accept that P is true. And so, it would be very bizarre for somebody to claim that they, believe the flat Earth theory, but they recognize it isn't true, right? They just want to believe it, or they desire to believe it, or it gives them comfort to believe it. So they just believe it anyway, even though they recognize it isn't true. That's just kind of incoherent. So for that reason, whenever we have an argument to the effect that a proposition is true, that just is an argument for believing that proposition, regardless of your desires. So yeah, I mean, I think there might be some difference perhaps between belief and action in general, because whereas beliefs seem to sort of be defined in terms of truth, or perhaps they aim at truth or something like that, with action in general, it's not like, it doesn't aim at anything. Actions can be self-regarding, they can be other regarding, maybe that accounts for why the notion of like categorical reasons for belief seems more appealing than categorical reasons for action. But yeah, I'm not persuaded by epistemic realism, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, like, so the way I reached to moral realism and moral anti-realism, like before, like 6 or 7 months ago, I would consider myself a moral realist, and the arguments like epic partners in crime and these intuitionist arguments did make sense, like to me at that time. And also I would say that I have a little bit different emotional attitudes compared to you. For example, like I think you said you do not care about animals, right? And personally, I do. I care about animals, and I do not want them to suffer. And so at that time, moral realism made sense to me, because these arguments, these intuitionist based arguments, these common sense intuitions, as moral realists would say, did make sense. But then I heard you, and like I thought about this, like after hearing you and how you are like completely unmoved by these arguments. And I thought that, yeah, his position does not sound something like nonsensical. Like that's the thing, like your position seemed to make sense. And perhaps I thought from a different perspective, like your position seemed to be more sensible than any moral realist position I've come across. And so this is why I thought like moral anti-realism makes more sense overall, to be honest. And in fact, moral error theory perhaps, or maybe non-cognitivism makes the most sense. And so I wanted to talk to you about moral error theory, your video, moral error theory, now what? Like you made a video a while ago, this one.
Yeah.
So you are a force fictionalist, you said, and not a substitutionary non-cognitivist. So why is that?
Did I say that? I can't remember. So I'm not sure whether or not I'm an error theorist. So for a long time I was a non-cognitivist, and then I sort of converted to error theory. But I, to be honest, have always been sort of wavering, between the two. And actually, as a result of talking to Lance Bush, who we mentioned before, he has a very sort of different take on the semantics of moral judgments, because of course when we're talking about like error theory versus non-cognitivism, we're talking about semantics, we're talking about what do moral judgments mean. And so this is so my actual position on this has long been my position actually, is that ordinary moral judgments, everyday moral judgments, are just vague and messy. And sometimes people use moral judgments to express beliefs, sometimes they use moral judgments to express emotions, sometimes they might be doing something different entirely. So there's all sorts of things. If you just look at the like everyday moral discourse, there's all sorts of things people can be doing. So like when we're talking about error theory versus non-cognitivism, as I see it, the question isn't so much, well, what do people mean, right? It's right, how can we kind of like take this discourse and like make it more precise? How can we sort of understand it in a way that maybe, I guess, sort of fixes it? Like it's part of a project that we might call sort of conceptual engineering, right? So rather than trying to understand how these concepts are actually used, we say, what's a better way of defining these concepts? How do we make these concepts more precise? How do we remove the vagueness and confusion of them? And it seems to me that error theory is simpler than non-cognitivism. It has a simpler semantics. It also seems to be more in line with the way that philosophers, at least, use moral language. So, I don't know, that kind of inclined me towards error theory.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I'm not like, am I really an error theorist? I'm not sure. I mean, like, I think very often moral language is non-cognitive, like actual moral language. When you look at moral discourse that real people engage in their everyday lives, I think that often is non-cognitive, but not always. So I'm not sure what position that would be categorized as.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose I have perhaps similar intuitions as you. Like I would consider myself non-cognitivist. The thing with error theory is just that, like, I kind of like the name error theory.
Yeah.
Like people are making an error when they say that it is objective or something. Like that seems to make sense to me. Like when you say something is objective, I mean, in relation to normativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that seems like an error to attribute facts out there. That's, I suppose, that's something appealing about error theory. But
Yeah.
generally,
Absolutely.
I think that we are like, when we are thinking of morality, like when something messed up happens, right? When something valuable, like when something we consider to be valuable or just, when we see that thing to be destroyed or something like that, we react emotionally, like non-cognitively, instead of like cognitively thinking about this. Oh, this is objectively wrong, and it is true that
Mm-hmm.
it is objectively wrong or something like that. It is always our emotions at the forefront when we see something horrible happening,
Yes.
right?
Mm.
So that's why I consider myself, I suppose, yeah, non-cognitivist. But I mean, so my question was to you basically, like, I suppose earlier in one of your videos, you commented that forced fictionalism kind of makes sense to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it maybe maybe it did. And it still does. Like, I mean, I find myself wavering on this stuff. So, you know, when somebody asks me this question, I might express this kind of thing, or I might just go with what I feel at the time.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that one point that's worth bearing in mind is that I think there's less distance between some of these positions than it might initially seem. You know, like you make this point that when we see things that we value being destroyed, you know, that moves us, and so that's non-cognitive. And I mean, of course, I totally agree with that. I think that a really useful distinction here is between semantics and pragmatics. So we can distinguish between the semantics of a statement, like the meaning of a statement, or maybe you could say the meaning that you would get if you were to like do a logical analysis of the statement, something like that, from what we are using the statement to do. And I mean, a great example of this would be if we are in a heated argument and I just sort of point and I shout, "There's the door." Now, when I do that, there's kind of two levels on which you can look at this. So if you just look at the semantics of the statement, well, it's a proposition, right? It's a claim about the location of the door. And, you know, if I point like that and the door's there, then the proposition is true. But you might think that that's sort of, you know, that's kind of missing the point, isn't it? Because obviously in the context in which I'm using that statement, I'm not really trying to express a proposition. I mean, I do express a proposition, but I'm using that to express my anger. I'm using that to express a command that you get out of the room. And so, you know, with this in mind, like, don't we really have a sort of, you know, don't we have the tools here for, you know, a kind of reconciliation between non-cognitivism and error theory? And I mean, bear in mind, like, this isn't a new distinction, right? This is a distinction that's been, you know, like we've had this for, you know, 100 years, right? So, but in this, can't we just say, well, you know, if I express the proposition, right? If I express the words abortion is wrong, okay, that's a proposition, right? And it's attributing a property to an action, but I'm also using it to express emotional non-cognitive states. That seems pretty plausible to me, as well. And so I guess you sort of end up saying, okay, maybe we endorse, you know, error theory about the semantics, but the pragmatics is non-cognitivist, right? Or sometimes, of course, so I mean, sometimes the pragmatics will also be cognitivist, because actually there are plenty of realists who will explicitly say, no, I am trying to describe facts. And so you can't really interpret what they're doing in non-cognitivist terms. And when you read like philosophy articles, I think it's less plausible to interpret those in non-cognitivist terms. But I think a lot of moral language can, you know, you can kind of have both. So I think that's what I would say. What I would say at this point.
Yeah. So I wanted to also talk to you about probably some ways that maybe moral realists can say that their ontology is not inflationary, but still be probably non-naturalists. So I think Joe Schmidt, he's a brilliant person. You know, he's like he works in philosophy of religion, deep. Yeah. So he's an agnostic philosopher, and he gave some objections to, you know, the moral argument, I suppose. And generally theists argue, no, okay, maybe not generally, I should say some theists argue that atheists cannot have objective morality or something like that.
Yeah.
And now, personally, I think that is that is false, because I mean there are philosophers who are moral realists, who are atheists, who are like moral platonists. I wanted to ask you about moral, like, so moral platonism is different than moral Aristotelianism, I suppose. Have you heard of moral Aristotelianism?
I'm not sure. I mean, so I've like, I know of Aristotle in the context of virtue ethics, and I'm also aware of like attempts to like get to moral realism using arguments from function, which are usually kind of Aristotelian in nature. But I don't know if that's exactly what you're referring to here. So I don't know.
Yeah. So here's what Joe said. Like, so Joe was talking to Trent Horn, who is a Catholic theist, and he said, like, if there is no God, like, what grounds our morality? What grounds objective morality? And I think Joe said that. So he said he said this, basically what you are reading, what's in front of you,
Right.
and
So
he said, like, sorry, but go ahead.
okay. I was just going to read it out, but I mean, I guess there's no need to do that. I can.
Yeah, you can just suppose read this and like say what are your thoughts about.
Okay, so what grounds equal rights? Probably the fact that we all share human nature with its various causal powers and capacities entailed therefrom. We just need the intrinsic nature of humanity, which might be a collection of essential features, capacities, etc., which in turn might be cast in Aristotelian, Platonic, or nominalist friendly terms. Why would something extrinsic to us have anything to do with our equality? Isn't it something about us that accounts for it? I think that I'm not sure how this relates to the question of realism and anti-realism anyway, because like there's a way of reading this where this is just like a claim in normative ethics. So, you know, like, okay, here's an example, right? I might be a utilitarian, right? And as a utilitarian, I might claim that like all sentient creatures have moral status, right? And that's just a claim about what's entailed by the, you know, utilitarian theory. Somebody who's a non-utilitarian might find, you know, ways of disagreeing with that. And then, you know, you can say, well, like, why is it that all sentient creatures have moral status? Well, because what matters is, you know, maximizing pleasure, minimizing suffering. All sentient creatures can experience pleasure and suffering, so that's why they all have moral status. But that's not an argument for realism, right? Like an anti-realist can think that. And I think along the same lines, right? Let's say that I'm just a straight up anti-realist, but I, you know, believe that we all have the same human nature. So I believe that there is this thing, human nature. I might think that, well, that's what justifies claims of equality. You know, you can make that claim from an anti-realist point of view. So yeah, I'm not sure how that's I mean, maybe that wasn't the point anyway, right? Like maybe he wasn't trying to get to moral realism, but I don't think any of this really gets you to moral realism. I would also say, though, I don't think that I believe that there is such a thing as the intrinsic nature of humanity. You know, I would just reject that claim. I think that's, you know, fairly well. I have problems philosophically with the idea of like essential and intrinsic properties. I'm certainly not sure how you can frame that in a nominalist friendly way. But I would also say that claims about like the intrinsic nature of humanity or human nature often have just straightforward empirical problems. You know, given the fact that, well, I mean, I think it's a fact that humans are products of biological evolution, and, you know, there's the sort of norm in biology is variation. I tend to have problems with claims about human nature, but obviously that depends on what the claim in question is, and I don't want to put words in Joe's mouth. So
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, and I think so. Where did he say like about moral Aristotelianism? Perhaps like yeah, because I've heard moral Platonism. Like moral Platonism is just I think that like abstract moral facts are abstract objects, right? That's correct, right?
I would have thought so. I don't usually hear that terminology that much in metaethics. Like I'm not sure like who would call themselves a moral Platonist. It might just be that maybe like different fields have slightly different terminologies for these things. Like I don't know, maybe in philosophy of religion, it's more common for people to say moral Platonism. But yeah, if somebody's saying that they're Platonist, I guess I would think of that in terms of abstract objects, like they're supposing that there are like entities out there. So it's like metaphysically robust. Whereas I would have thought that moral Aristotelianism is going to have something to do with claims about like human flourishing, human function, right? Like what's the sort of what counts as a flourishing human life, and what are the essential human capacities and things like that.
Yeah, interesting. So I suppose that seems yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. So you talked about like I suppose now we are moving towards a bit different conversation. Like in one of your videos you mentioned like something about death. Like you said you are afraid of death. Like am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Why are you afraid of death?
I don't think that there's like a reason for it. I mean, certainly there's not a reason that I'm really consciously aware of. It seems to be just a sort of brute fact of my psychology. Oh, actually, I should say, so I don't believe there's any kind of afterlife, right? So, I mean, I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but my expectation is that when I die, that's just gonna be it. There'll be nothing, right? So, and I want to continue existing. I do not want to cease existing. And now, if you ask, like, well, like, why is it that non-existence is so troubling to you? I can't give an answer. It just is. I mean, like, there's no further reason. I just want to keep existing, and the idea of permanent cessation of existence is just kind of horrifying to me. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I believe that you are going to be okay, Kane. You are going to enjoy yourself in heaven. Maybe like if whatever like things you like, whatever joys you care about, you want. Like do you like music? I mean, movies. Like you will get music, movies, video games. All I think all our innocuous desires will be continuously fulfilled. Like that's the kind of optimism that
How
I
do you conceive of this? I mean, I'm just curious. Like, so do you think that when I move into the afterlife, right, I'm going to have, like, would it be that I sort of have something like this body and that I can still, perceive things?
so
or is it like, a kind of, well, something else? What
maybe
would it be like?
I think I would say yes. because I mean, from my experience, from our experience, basically, like it is our experience is with bodies, right? So I think we will have our bodies, but we will not have undesirable things with our bodies. Like perhaps there are certain things about our bodies that we do not like. We might
Okay.
replace them with something else, I suppose, you know, be able to. And yeah, and I suppose that like the view I hold, like one objection to my view is that like if everything is so good in heaven, then why not kill why not kill yourself, right? Like that's the objection to my view. And I say that look, the reason why you should not kill yourself here is because people care about you here now, and they do not want to lose you. They do not
Mhm.
want to suffer. They do not want to see you gone. And another thing is like we are not, I mean, some people are not really sure. Like some people are atheists, right?
Yeah.
So to them, if someone kills themselves, it affects, it has a greater impact in some sense, right? Because they 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 cannot think that there is an afterlife for them, right? The person is just destroyed. There is no rest in peace, right?
Mhm.
Because there is no peace since since that person is dead. So so yeah, that's why you should not kill yourself. And I suppose it's in relation to the theodicy I give to the problem of evil, problem of suffering. I suppose I say that look, we are in this world, and think of this world like a multiplayer game. Now in that multiplayer game, if you like quit directly, you are like you're like annoying and your teammates, you are making your teammates sad, you know. And that's kind of, you know, really rude thing, you know, not something that, like something that is, I suppose, horrific, you know, in my opinion. If you just like uh just off yourself to any place, and I think God might punish people who rationally perhaps kill themselves. So maybe I should not use the word rational, because personally I do not like to use rational, irrational, stuff like those, words like those. I would say like, if you are not in a distress, not in like a huge suffering,
Mhm.
then in my view, killing yourself would cause a lot of suffering to others. And in that sense, God would probably punish you for that, for
Well,
some time, in
I
my
guess that
view.
would
I
be
mean,
a
it's
good
not.
reason not to do it then. I mean, if there's potential punishment, then that's that's enough for me. I think
Yeah,
that
I mean, yes, that's
if it see, I care about other people, but I'm not sure I care about them that much that, you know, if you offered me paradise, I would just take paradise. I don't care what effect it would have. If it would make other people sad, then I'm like, yeah, whatever. They're going to be sad anyway, because like I'm going to die eventually, right? Sooner or later, I'm going to die, and that's going to make
yeah,
people sad. So I just kind of feel like, well, does it really make a difference whether whether I die now or, you know, in 40 years or like whenever? I mean,
yeah,
oh, 40 years, that might be a little bit pessimistic. Let's say 50 years. But you know, does it really make that much of a difference? I'm not sure. You know,
yeah,
so
perhaps. So here's what I'm thinking, right? Like, as I said, like God would punish you for some time, depending on how much suffering you caused, in my view. Now, it's more like if everybody started doing this, started killing themselves because they truly believe that there is paradise. You know, like there was a cult in USA where it's called Heaven's Gate, where
yeah.
they kill themselves together, I think. And and that caused suffering to the parents of the people who did that. I think parents, friends, family members, and stuff like that. And I think that is something God cares about, just like we care about suffering, you know. So like, even though you said like they would be sad and you would not care, but you still care
I care a little bit.
a little bit, right? A little bit about their suffering. Like, I mean, so I suppose this, like, your I have read that, I listened that your mom passed away, right, a while ago, I think.
Yeah, in October 2020.
Yeah, yeah, and you were sad, right, due to that.
Surprisingly, relatively little sadness. I expected it to be more, but it never, like, I was very close to my mum. Like, we I don't know, I think we had a very, very, very good relationship. I would say that, like, as far as parents go, you know, she did a very good job. And yeah, you know, I saw her very frequently because I lived in the same house as her. Obviously I was away at university for a lot of time, but I would often come back. So, you know, we interacted a lot, and I think we had a great relationship. So, you know, when she died, I was expecting it to, like, really hit me hard. And it didn't really. It was something where it was like, okay, you know, I have some practical stuff to deal with. You know, I had to deal with the house and other things, you know, and get practical things sorted out. But like, that, there never came a point where I felt like hit by grief. It just didn't happen. I don't know whether that's, maybe I'm just weird, or maybe this is how it is for a lot of people. And I don't know. I'm honestly not sure, but I wouldn't say that I was particularly sad. Obviously, I'm, you know, I would much rather her still be alive, but I
Yeah,
didn't feel a powerful emotion.
yeah, I'm different than you, way different. Like, I'm much more emotional, I suppose. Yeah, and in some sense, it would be really heartbreaking for me to imagine that people just die and everything just is dead and cold. Yeah, so in some sense, yeah, that's the thing, that belief in God is, I suppose, helpful for myself. Yeah, that's cool. And is there any other thing that I wanted to talk with you about? All right, great. What are some things, like, do you have some questions for me, I suppose, like, based on my view of the world?
I don't know. I hadn't prepared anything. I mean, I guess if, like, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, we could talk about it if you want. I mean, ultimately, like, I don't believe in God or an afterlife or anything like that. It's just because I've never seen any convincing reason to do so. So I guess we could go into that if you want, but I don't have any, I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't have anything in particular to say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think it's also based on, like, your emotional attitudes, right? Like, if you are not, maybe you would care if like, if God is caring, compassionate, right? Who does not torture people forever. I think you would love to meet your friends who died, in heaven, I suppose. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would like there to be a heaven, because that would mean that there's an afterlife, and I, would continue to exist. So that's the main condition for me. I'm not really so concerned about other people continuing to exist, because a lot of other people say that they actually don't want immortality anyway. So, I mean, I find that really weird, but if that's the case for them, fair enough. I know a lot of people who are quite happy with the idea that when they die, that's just the end. In fact, there was a philosopher, A.J. Ayer, who had a near-death experience. And as a result of that, he sort of moderated his view that there was no afterlife. And he said, I'm not so completely convinced that death will be the end of me, but I continue to hope that it will be.
That's weird.
So, but that's the sort of sentiment that I've come across quite a lot. It seems to me that having spoken to people about this, about 50% want immortality and 50% do not. So that's why I say I'm not really so concerned about like meeting my friends, because some of those friends don't want to continue existing, and if that's not what they want, then I guess there's no, like, I don't want to impose it on them.
Yeah, but here's the thing though, right? I think there's some influence of traditional religions, right? Like hell, eternal conscious torment and stuff like that. Like if afterlife consists of literal extreme misery, agony, and suffering, then yeah, it is better not to exist, right? Like I'm talking about absolute suffering here, like getting tortured continuously, right? Like in some religions, there's like depictions, like horrific depictions about how people would suffer, like their skin would regenerate, like they would be burning and their skins would regenerate continuously so that they can suffer again.
Yeah.
God will, like in their view, God will make sure that their suffering never ends. They never become numb to their suffering. And there's like really bizarre torture things happening, like people, like in in one of the I think non-canon gospels, like I think it is apocalypse of Peter, and in that people will be hung by their tongue with a sharp with a sharp object or something. And I think these kinds of views of afterlife, these kinds of horrific, painful views about afterlife, maybe they are doing some sort of influence, And maybe another thing that it would be influencing people's decision that they want to die would probably is that maybe it's like depression or certain other thing, like people think that things would get old and they would be bored. But then I'm thinking, well, are you bored right now about things like because to me heaven is much better, like much more enjoyable than earth, like significantly more enjoyable than earth in my view. So like boredom would be, I think, very rare in only in cases like, because sometimes maybe boredom is important for like creativity, right? Like
Yeah.
perhaps in those cases, but yeah, but
I find the boredom point very puzzling, and I actually think that you might be right about this. So some people say they'd get bored with an infinite life, but the reason why I think they might just be wrong about that, is that our minds are finite. So like I mean, if you lived an infinite amount of time, you'd just forget stuff. and then you could do it again and experience it anew again. I mean, and in fact, even in the short lives that we have, we forget loads of stuff. I mean, I've forgotten so much stuff. Like so presumably if I was to live 10,000 years, well, I would forget 1,000 times more things, and that would mean that I could just do it anew and experience it anew, and there wouldn't be boredom. So I think that the problem of boredom is kind of just resolved by the fact that our minds are finite. But I don't know if like, why is it that people don't want immortality? I don't think it's really to do with the like influence of traditional views of hell or anything like that, because, well, like, I mean, look, all I can say is I've spoken to people about this, and a lot of them, like, I know, just don't have any belief in that whatsoever. Like, I mean, my dad, for example. So he's a guy that I know very well, and like, I am really sure that he is not motivated either by depression or by a belief in hell, or a worry about hell. He just genuinely isn't concerned about continuing to exist forever. That's just not something that bothers him at all. Like, I think it's like he wants to have a long life, but within the sort of normal human constraints of like normal human biology. He just has no motivation to have anything beyond that. And I've known other people like that as well, and I wish I was like that. It would make me a lot happier. I would be less worried about what's inevitably coming my way. But
yeah, I mean, so like, people also sometimes like desensitize themselves, right, to certain things. Like, so sometimes people are not moved by certain things because they are desensitized, about stuff. And like, so when I think generally when we give people some things that they love, that they will get in heaven or something like that, I think people would want to live more. Like, because even suicide generally, it seems to me, is generally to escape suffering and misery. It seems to me like depression, as far as I read, as far as I know, it's like persistent low mood and like continuous tiredness. And that's the major thing that motivates people to kill themselves, And another thing would be like, if you are going, you are going to get like tortured, then it is better to like just be destroyed than experience that extreme pain and suffering. But however, if you get rid of these two, and you talk about some great things that they are doing right now. Like, here's the thing: when people say they do not have any motivation for afterlife, right? But I'm thinking, why do you have motivation to live another day? Like, why not? Because there seems to be some motivation to live, right? That's why we are both alive right now. And your father is also alive. And a lot of people are alive, at least some motivation. Even if we cannot like find it, like say exactly what the motivation is, but there is some motivation. Maybe perhaps it's, you just like it, it's just, you just brutally like living, so that's the thing that confuses me when people like say that I have no problem with death, right? Because when death coming to you, like when death like comes at you, like cancer, maybe cancer is gives you a lot of suffering, perhaps that's why you want to avoid it. But suppose like someone wants to shoot you on your face, I think, and they're not like perhaps someone like surprisingly barging in your home. Like you can see them that they have pointed a gun at you for some time. Why avoid that, right? If you do not care about living,
Yeah,
why avoid that? Why not get shot? Why not
it's
let?
that's a puzzle. I don't know the answer. I mean, I guess if I was one of these people, I might be able to say something. I find that weird as well. I mean, as much as there are people who claim that they don't want immortality, it does seem to be the case that if you give people the option of having, like, more life that's just as good as the life they've had, so we're assuming that they're not going to their cognitive faculties aren't going to degrade, and they're not going to lose their physical abilities or anything. But if they have the option of extending their life and having more of the stuff they've had, they take it, right? I mean, and again, unless you have depression or something like that, like, no, we want to live longer, we want more life. So yeah, I mean, that seems a little bit difficult to reconcile with the idea that they just don't care about ceasing to exist. I don't know, I can't speak for them.
Yeah,
I mean,
perhaps.
I suppose one reason why I guess I'm not really inclined to push the argument is just, look, if you were to make this argument and convince them that they do want to exist, well, now you've just created suffering, right? I mean, because now they're going to want to continue existing, and they're going to think that they're going to die, and they're going to be terrified about it. So I'm happy to just let them carry on believing that that they they don't care about immortality.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
seems
yeah,
kinder.
that makes sense. But I mean, in my view, I think you're going to be okay. So you should care about living, right? At least
Well, yeah, but
now,
I
because
mean, I what reason? I mean, I don't see a reason to think I'm going to be okay. So, you
yeah, of
know,
course, you don't have that reason, perhaps. Maybe like I suppose I can like maybe request or recommend you to maybe like look into philosophy of religion if you want to, because it's in some sense like a treasure, right? If you believe in God, if
well, I
you
mean,
come
it's
to
not like
believe in God.
it's not as if I'm like totally ignorant of it. I mean, it's not my field of expertise, but
Yeah.
I mean, I did a philosophy degree. We covered philosophy of religion. That was one of the courses. Actually, I taught it for a little while. So, I do have a familiarity with some of the arguments, and I just I wasn't convinced. I think that actually it would be very, very difficult to move me on this, because my sort of general epistemology, my general perspective is quite, I think, quite extreme. Like so I tend to be a pretty hardcore sort of empiricist. And so what that means is that there are a lot of arguments that like have, I guess, might have like some force for some atheists that just will not move me at all. Because in order for me to even kind of get on board with some of the premises of those arguments, you'd have to like transform my epistemology. So I'll give you just a quick example. Like take, for instance, fine-tuning arguments for the existence of God. I don't know whether those are the sort of arguments you might make, but obviously, those are arguments that are out there. The problem with this is that even if I were to accept that that there's some sense in which our best physical theories are fine-tuned, I would not conclude that this would tell us anything about the way the universe is, because I tend to be an anti-realist about scientific theories. I see scientific theories as instruments, as being, tools for systematizing, predicting, and controlling observable phenomena. So, the fact that we have a physical theory which, kind of has very precise parameters, and which we might say is like fine-tuned, I don't then draw a conclusion about the way the universe is from that. And actually, the same point applies to any argument which treats God as an explanatory hypothesis. I would view that in an instrumentalist way. So like, even if it were the case that you could convince me that our best scientific theories entail that there's a God or anything like that, I would just say, well, okay, so, so what? That doesn't tell us anything about the way the world is. That just means that, it's entailed by a model that allows us to systematize, predict, and control the observable phenomena. So you can see that from this kind of hardcore sort of empiricism, it's very difficult to kind of move me. Of course, you might convince me that I'm just completely wrong about the empiricism. There might be a kind of conceptual revolution, and I endorse some totally different epistemology. But yeah, I think from where I am now, it's hard for me to see like how an argument, how it could possibly work that I could be convinced.
So Bayes de van Frassen is also an Astance empiricist, right?
Right, yeah.
And he believes in God.
I know, yeah. But so yes, that's true. And I'm not entirely sure what his reasons are. But the thing is with Van Frassen is that so his account of like belief or like rational belief allows people, and actually I have a very similar account of rationality. It allows you to rationally believe without justification, right? So you can just like make the assumption that there's a God, and that can be perfectly rational on Van Frassen's view. And so that's fine. Like if you have been brought up in a religious tradition and you find it kind of compelling, that's like a belief that you've had, or that for some reason has emerged in you, then fine, you can continue to believe that rationally without having to give a justification for it. But the problem is that's not the case for me, right? Like, yeah. I don't have the belief. So it's one thing to say that it can be rational to believe in God. It's another thing to present reasons that can convince me to change my mind. Yeah. And so that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it also like, in some sense, maybe motivation sometimes can affect beliefs, right? I mean, so perhaps like you have a positive desire for God to exist, right? Suppose, and you suppose look into some of the recent literature on philosophy of religion, like the recent literature by Alexander Proust and Joshua Rasmussen would be perhaps interesting to you, because as far as I know, like Joshua Rasmussen's view of God is also very optimistic, and his argument is also it seems plausible to me. It makes sense to me. So maybe perhaps looking into those new recent arguments, maybe you could think about something, because I'm not sure if they are. I'm not really sure if they are like presenting the hypothesis of God as like a scientific theory, or
Oh yeah, I mean, so to be clear, I wasn't trying to suggest that was how like all of those arguments work. I'm aware that there are other approaches. I was just using that as an example, like it's just a kind of, because I suppose the point is that with most atheists, right, it's like, like you just have to kind of get them on board with the fine-tuning claim. Like if you can show that our best physical theories entail fine-tuning, then they will accept that is true as a description of the way the world is, right? Whereas I won't, right? So that's just an example of like where you have more work to do with me. In the case of like these other types of arguments for God, again, you're going to have more work to do with me, because a lot of these arguments appeal to like modal properties, properties of necessity and contingency. And again, I'm like a hardcore, and I'm a hardcore empiricist, so I'm an anti-realist about modality. So it's like, you know, most atheists aren't, right? Most atheists are happy to get on board with metaphysical theorizing about modality. I'm not. So, you know, you kind of have the same sort of problem. But I'm not saying like, I'm not ruling out that I could ever be convinced. I mean, for one thing, you might convince me to give up on empiricism.
Yeah, I mean,
But I think you'd have a hard time with me.
yeah, but modal realism is not. Wait, modal realism by David Lewis is not something that I think even philosophers of religion,
No, I
many
mean,
philosophers
when I say that I'm a hardcore, so like, yeah, I don't accept modal realism, but I mean, like, I don't buy modal claims. I'm a kind of pragmatist about modal claims. So I don't think there's any facts of the matter about what's like So the very idea of like metaphysical necessity and metaphysical contingency, I think just doesn't make any sense. I just reject that across the board, regardless of whether you view it in terms of, you know, concrete possible worlds or in some other way, which, you know, yeah, I mean, most people would interpret it differently. So, you know, it's modality in general that I'm a kind of pragmatist about.
Okay, it's so the pragmatism about modality. That's interesting. Like, I mean, I would also consider myself pragmatist, but why? Like, it seems like, so what does it mean to be a pragmatist about modality?
Okay, I think a useful way to approach this is to suppose, for the sake of argument, that necessitarianism is true, right? So let's just suppose that, you know, the world is completely deterministic and that the initial conditions were fully determined. So there's only one possible way the world could be. Even if that were the case, I think that our modal discourse would be basically the same as it is now, right? Like, I would still be able to say things like, you know, it would still be perfectly legitimate for me to say things like, I could have put on a different shirt this morning. And like, what does that come down to? Well, you know, it comes down to the fact that like I have other shirts in my wardrobe, and, you know, there was no like physical entity blocking me from accessing my wardrobe. You know, picking out the shirt that I actually put on involves basically the same kind of action as picking out a different shirt, you know, those sorts of things. So I can, you know, legitimately say that, and it's a very useful kind of discourse as well, you know, even if it's the case that actually the shirt that I'm wearing is metaphysically necessary, right? Like, maybe it's just somehow like because the initial conditions are fully determined, and, you know, the world is causally deterministic, so maybe it's just a matter of necessity that I'm wearing the shirt that I am. It would still be legitimate, let's say. It would still be assertable to say that, you know, I could have put on the shirt that I did. But I think my view on this is that, you know, the world just is the way it is, and it doesn't have any, you know, there are no sort of modal properties in the world at all. Modality is something that's like a feature of our models, of our way of thinking about things. It's not something that's a feature of the world.
Cool. That's interesting. Maybe perhaps I'll have to think about a pragmatic argument for for God to maybe kind of influence you. But I mean, yeah, perhaps. I suppose you would still, as I think, hope that the God that I'm envisioning, the optimistic one, exists and there is an afterlife. So I think,
yeah, it would be very nice.
yeah, that would be
I
very
mean,
cool.
I'm in favor of it. Like,
Yeah, that would be cool. So my interest in philosophy of religion is about this stuff, because I think that, like, it feels good to know that someone cares about you, even when there is no human being who cares about you, right? Like some person, if there is some person who cares about you, who is not going to abandon you, right? When you are in distress, who will save you in some sense from the misery, pain, and suffering and destruction. I think it feels good. You know, it feels kind of like a safety, safety thing, right? Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned that you don't accept the sort of traditional views of hell and so on, but you do think that there is some sense of punishment for people who create suffering. So I just wondered, what is that? Like, what do you think of punishment as involving?
So I think of punishment like it's a pluralistic way. I think of punishment. So I think that if you cause suffering, God will punish you for that. And one reason is disincentivizing people to commit these kinds of crimes. And another reason is, I suppose, to give pleasure to God and the victim who suffered because of the attacker. These are the two reasons. The third reason is, I suppose, correction or rehabilitation. Like God cares about people, being in a serene and tranquil place rather than in a place filled with misery. And punishment is helpful in making the world less miserable, I suppose, less overall less miserable, I think. And and that's the thing. That's why I think God would punish people. Like, as a moral anti-realist, I think God's punishment is based on God's emotional attitudes, right? Because God cares, and since God cares about people, so God cares about what they are doing to each other, and he probably does not want people to torture each other without 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 consent, and like traumatizing each other. God does not want that, in my view. So there will be some sort of punishment for those who cause suffering, who do these bad things, who have at least violated like consent, and like punishment will be proportional to the suffering that the person has caused, and perhaps the way the consent is broken. That's my view about punishment. Like, I do not think that there is like infinite torture forever, because that's just horrific, right? I mean, at that point it is better not to be born than, like, I would like agree with Schopenhauer on that.
Yeah, it feels like it would be kind of messed up to create a world where you're populating it with entities who might end up being tortured forever. That would be,
and I mean, it's not like up. I mean, and I mean, it's not like God is just popped into existence and he found heaven and hell, which are like forever, and God is like, well, that's what I have to deal with, I guess. Like, God created these places according to the traditionalist view. So I think creating a place of infinite torture, right? And remember, the intensity of torture will also be exceptionally high compared to any torture that's taking place on Earth. So it will be horrific, very horrific. And that just seems the most messed up thing I've ever encountered. So, and I do not think God is like that, in my view, you know. Yeah. Okay, so I suppose I have asked enough questions, and we had a fun chat, I suppose. So, did you like our conversation?
Yeah, that was cool. Enjoyed it.
Great to have you, Kane. Have a wonderful day, man.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that.